Despite what you may think of them, people love the Cars movies. No, they're not in love with the stories, characters, or visuals, though some are. They're just in love with talking about the conceptual implications of an animated movie that raises a ton of questions about its in-universal logic. And I'm fully aware that a chunk of you watching will find even the existence of this video to be ridiculous and the topic unworthy of discussion. I get where you're coming from, but the random truth is that dissecting these colorful, magical kids movies is actually pretty fun. Even for me, someone who was never in love with the Cars movies themselves, or all that interested in the question, did the Cars take over mankind? And if they did, how? I think it's fairly obvious that the filmmakers at Pixar didn't have a meta commentary in mind about AI taking over the world through the cars we love, or any other idea. Well, maybe they did. But what is clear to me is that they created a world imaginative enough for various methods of interpretation, which is why something like the Pixar Theory exists, suggesting that all of the Pixar movies themselves share a single universe explained by their frequent cameos, Easter eggs, and plot themes. For the handful of you who don't know this, I'm actually the originator of this theory. Yeah, me, John Negroni of John and Theory. I wrote the Pixar Theory in 2013 after watching a video on crack.com a year earlier that suggested a few of the movies might share a universe, and they ultimately give up. My theory finished the work and brought in some of the biggest twists and clues I could come up with, including a working theory for why and how a world is ruled by cars, even though there's ample evidence of humans once being a thing. It wasn't until years later that I wrote the book for this, the Pixar Theory, which finalized a lot of my early ideas and made them more convincing, basically. Cars especially was an avenue, no pun intended, that I spent more time fleshing out, which is what we're mainly here to discuss. And if that sounds bonkers or self-serving to you, well, you're probably right. But it was just earlier this year that Pixar producer Jay Ward, who worked on Cars, outright confirmed a huge piece of my theory related to the movie, even though he'd said in the past that he doesn't believe in the Pixar Theory itself, and his overall take on the explanation behind the Cars universe kind of differs from mine. So what was it, though, that I got right about Cars? Well, as you can probably tell from the headline, this is all about what happened to the humans and why. And for the sake of time, I'll give you the ridiculously short version of the Pixar Theory itself to set this up, though only the most relevant details you need to know now, because a lot of people are going to be caught up already. There's a link in the episode description to a more recent version of the theory if you're interested. Okay, so one of the main tenets of the Pixar Theory is that many of these films allude to human emotion being a source of actual real-life energy. It's the energy that makes toys come to life, powers an entire civilization of blue-collar monsters, gives some people superpowers, and residually breathes life and personality into machines. In other words, humans are batteries, and a lot of the phenomena in the Pixar universe is explained by this very idea. Which brings us to Cars. In the timeline of the Pixar movies, Cars occurs during the off-screen events of WALL-E, or 2110 to be exact. Mankind has abandoned Earth because all of the garbage they incinerated starting in 2105 polluted the atmosphere to dangerous levels of toxicity before they cleaned up the last of it. This was called Operation Cleanup, which is what we see in the opening of WALL-E. With humans gone and most of the world cleaned up, 700 years pass before humans return thanks to WALL-E's intervention. In that 700 years, we get to the Cars movies, and similar to the movie Toy Story, the cars themselves actually come to life because humans are not around. Except humans aren't around at all, so to make up for this, the cars take on the personalities of the last human who owned them. This explains why there are flashbacks in the first Cars movie to a version of the 20th century where cars are the people instead of the actual people. They have false memories of events that really happened in the dates that are mentioned, like Doc Hudson's races in the 1950s and Radiator Springs being founded in the early 1900s, but through the perspective of a car instead of a human. It's a simple enough explanation that gets around the conceptual insanity of a supposed parallel universe where humans never existed supposedly, despite all plot holes that argue the opposite. And it conveniently fits the framework of a shared universe of Pixar movies for those who find that sort of thing convincing. Personally, I think it makes the context of the Cars movies a bit more interesting at that, to know that it could possibly be grounded in a world that's familiar and has interesting stakes beyond occasionally clumsy world building, let's be honest, fixing some of the minor flaws of a franchise that albeit has bigger problems depending on how Cars 3 turns out. And I'm not alone in thinking this, as I already mentioned before, Jay Ward has proposed shades of the same explanation for where humans went, specifically during an interview with Screen Crush's Matt Singer. To be fair, his theory and mine are still noticeably different overall, and he made clear to Singer that this is in no way Pixar's official stance or canon. Personally, I don't think they should or need to answer questions like that anyway. That said, Ward's theory is that the cars themselves rose up against humans after deciding that because of the rise of self-driving cars, they can rule the world instead. He points out that cars getting smarter is the root of all of this, and humans are, as he puts it, extra weight. Though we disagree on this part, mainly because it has its own obvious holes, Ward does think that the car takes on the personality of the last person who drove it. A linchpin of my own explanation from a few years ago. What happened to the cars before WALL-E? You might already know the answer to that question if you're one of the 12 people who went out to see Cars 2, which is centered around the new plot detail that the cars face a resource crisis and are running out of oil and gasoline. Makes sense if you have a world already short on fossil fuels and now populated by cars that run 24/7, so by the time we get to WALL-E, it's implied that the cars died out on their own. This also explains why the monsters have to go back in time through the doors to find energy to power their civilization because there are no fossil fuels left, and oh, sorry, that's Pixar Theory stuff you have no context for, my bad. Anyway, that's frankly, bizarre, and sure, it's convoluted, but it is one way to interpret the logical implications of the Cars movies. It's the one that I like to talk about and bring up, and honestly, it sounds about right based on the material we're working with, So, hey, at least I'm not trying to convince you that cars are insects.